Chapter 19. Bonham pulled away from the shipyards and slowly approached one of Trident Station's 7 large docking bays. Dickerson watched it approach through the observation window, his eyes practically bugging out of his head. He'd never seen anything like it. The thick, rectangular bow curved outward, providing a metal shield around the forward compartments. With any luck, that was where Von Ahn kept its passengers. A nice, armored, well-protected piece of ship is all he wanted. "What do you think, Gunny?" Elliot asked. He and Murdoch sat atop a few of the ammo and weapons crates. Von Ahn had said they should bring small arms. Dickerson took that to mean anything that could be operated by a single human. As such, he had rocket launchers with crates of various warheads, flechette rifles, gravitic rifles, vibra blades, and a slew of other emergency combat equipment. He didn't know how much cargo room Von Ahn had, but by the looks of it, Dickerson, Rana, Elliot, and Murdoch had more than enough to put a dent in a cargo bay. As the ship turned and he saw it in profile, he realized it was larger than he'd first assumed. The area he imagined to be the cargo bay jutted out further on one side, the seams of a giant hatch barely visible. The ship appeared as though it could comfortably fit 50. He imagined they'd feel buried inside of it. "Thought we were going in a tin can," Elliot asked. "Guess not," Dickerson said. Rana, the former SFN security officer, now Marine, stood a few meters away, her arms crossed and looking half asleep. "Gunny, we already got our staterooms assigned?" Dickerson snickered. "I think we're getting individualized stasis coffins." "Hoorah!" Rana grinned. "Hope you brought a deck of cards, Gunny. This sounds like a boring trip." "If only," Dickerson said and glanced at Murdoch. The kid was looking down at the deck, hands locked together, fingers fidgeting. "Murdoch?" The Marine started and looked up at Dickerson. "Yes, Gunny Dickerson?" "Don't look as though you want to be here." Murdoch grinned. "Who would want to board an SC-controlled ship to go who knows where to do who knows what?" Dickerson nodded. "You were dumb enough to volunteer." Murdoch rolled his eyes. "Like when I joined up?" Elliot snickered. "We were all dumb enough to join up." "You could always go back," Dickerson offered. Elliot, Rana, and Murdoch all shared a glance before flipping him the bird. Dickerson laughed and stared back out at Von Ahn. The ship had executed another series of thruster burns and headed directly for the dock, an umbilicus extending from the midships. "Ready to go?" Dickerson turned and saw Kelly standing in her combat suit near the entrance to the docking bay. She looked just as she had 40 minutes ago when he'd finally kissed her one last time. "Here to see us off, Lieutenant?" Elliot asked. "Here to make sure you animals behave yourselves," Kelly said, and pointed at Rana. "You might be the medic, but don't hesitate to bust heads." Rana shook her head. "Don't worry, Lieutenant. I'll drug them if they get too rowdy." Kelly's grin touched something inside him. He already knew he'd miss her. He just didn't know how void damn much he'd miss her until this very moment. "Marines," Kelly said, and the four snapped to attention. "Good hunting," she said with a salute. Dickerson and his squad returned the salute. After dropping hers, and they theirs, she headed out of the bay and toward the pilot's briefing room, no doubt preparing for another flying lesson. The boom of the umbilicus connecting to the cargo hatch was enough to make Dickerson and everyone else flinch. "Someone's first time?" Elliot snickered. "If so," Dickerson said, "Black needs to give them some lessons." He'd already briefed his Marines about what to expect from the entity, at least as far as Dickerson's experience. He'd also already made it clear they were under his command no matter what orders Von Ahn might give. In other words, they were his Marines and no one else's. The airlock cycled and the inner hatch opened wide upon a generously sized cargo area, an SV Null variation sitting in its moorings along with 2 gravitic skiffs. The bright light bathing the compartment sparkled off fresh Atmos steel and other alloys, and he could practically smell the plasteel curing inside the bay. His wristband activated, and Dickerson wasn't surprised to see the caller. "Hello, Von Ahn." "Hello, Gunny Dickerson," they said happily. He gestured to his Marines. "Permission to come aboard?" Von Ahn sounded confused. "Why would you need permission?" They paused a beat. "Ah, an ancient tradition stretching back long before humans discovered space travel." "Correct," Dickerson said. "I'll try and remember to pay more attention. You understand that without context it's—" "May we come aboard?" Elliot asked warily. Von Ahn was silent for a beat. "You have permission to come aboard," they said, the cheeriness back in their voice. "Thank you, Von Ahn." He turned to the Marines and jerked a thumb at the cargo bay. "Get moving. We're on a clock." Elliot stood straight and activated the grav controls on the crate. "Aye, aye, Gunny," he shouted, and moved the first crate down the umbilicus. By the time Dickerson turned around, Rana and Murdoch had followed suit. With a sigh, he moved to his own. "My apologies for the confusion," Bonan said. "No need to apologize," Dickerson said, and he meant it. "I'll try and remember to give you more context. If I don't, please ask." Bonan sounded pleased with themselves. "Another reason I chose you, Gunny Dickerson. I'm glad to have you on this mission." He didn't know what to say to that as he moved the crate down the umbilicus. He and his Marines had one more trip to finish loading the bay. Then it was getting out of the system, getting into stasis, and waking up in a void-damned cemetery of a star system. Cemetery, if you're lucky. Right, if I'm lucky. If we're all damned lucky. Kelly had purposely delayed her walk to the pilot's lounge so she could stand before one of the viewing areas and watch Von On's umbilicus retract, her lover and her Marines now at the whim of a machine she didn't know and certainly didn't trust. They would be away from Trident for quite some time, and while Dickerson would be asleep for most of it, she didn't think she'd catch a wink until he returned. The ship pushed away from the dock using its thrusters, carefully obeying the trio's imposed velocity limits. She stood there for a few minutes, just long enough to watch it turn into a faraway dot. Her wristband vibrated and she smiled at the image of Dickerson. He waved to her with the AOK symbol, Rana, Elliot, and Murdoch behind him flashing goofy salutes. His way of saying, "See you later," rather than goodbye. Boy, but she loved him. Kelly wiped away a tear and headed to the pilot's lounge, hoping Oakes wouldn't be too upset regarding her tardiness. She thought, however, he'd understand. Chapter 20. Dunn hadn't been sleeping for obvious reasons. He and Black had spent several hours in block time until his brain felt like mush, and she warned him he might have a seizure. That had been last night. The night before, they'd only gone for 2 hours, and he still felt punch-drunk from that when they started the next round. The questions about Von On, about the collective's interest in Proxima, and the Scar kept Black spinning up new simulations, new conversations with the trio, and Dunn wanting to tear out his own eyes in frustration. Nothing added up. There was obviously something at Proxima that affected QE comms. That meant the collective couldn't send automated probes. They needed a local entity and a flesh-and-blood crew to explore. Von On was designed to carry a human payload and presumably protect it while it did, well, whatever it was planning to do. Couple that with the Scar becoming active, and Dunn was smart enough to put two and two together. Or was he? The Scar might have started doing its thing because they'd sent a probe through it. Maybe it would go back to sleep in a few days if they stopped messing with it. One thing was certain, though. If they continued toying with it, they might accidentally open it. That was something Dunn desperately wanted to avoid. The trio was currently printing 2 new probes at the shipyards, both equipped with exhaustive sensor arrays and gravitic drives. They would be flying to Pluto space next shift. By this time, 3 shifts from now, the probes would arrive at their target and, if everything worked out right, Trident would begin receiving telemetry, even without QE comms. Maybe then he could get some sleep. If the Scar hadn't decided to come alive, he would have been perfectly content to ignore Pluto until they were ready to go back there. Instead, he was already planning for a mission and he damn sure didn't want to send anyone on. If that was, there was a reason to. Still, planning was planning. After a few slip points, he finally made it to the Grav Lab. This time, Xi hadn't posted messages all over the place demanding attention. That squeaky wheel had already been greased, so to speak. Upon entering the lab, he saw the same hapless receptionist. The man didn't look nearly as spooked this time, but still seemed as though he was in the last place in the galaxy he wanted to be. After calling for Reed, the receptionist watched Dunn with guilty, bashful eyes. Dunn suddenly felt as though this was the last place in the galaxy he wanted to be. When he saw Reed open the hatch with a smarmy question on his face, he was sure of it. Reed once again led him inside the G lab where the gravitic engine floated in its disassembled state. The scientists weren't around it, however. Instead, they were gathered around another device hanging in the air in much the same state. Smaller and thinner than the gravitic engine, it looked more like a flat block of shining metal with a rifle barrel protruding from it. The barrel, however, had vents scattered up and down its length as well as several sparkling nubs. A steady, needle-thin beam of blue light shot from it into a target in front of the bulkhead. The scientist seemed to once again ignore his presence as well as that of Reed's, but he didn't think it was intentional. They all seemed so focused on the hollow display floating above the device that he and Reed might as well not exist. The blue light emanating from the device stuttered, flickered, and died. The team groaned in unison. "Again?" Reed asked. One of the scientists, Pauling, wiped a sheen of sweat from her forehead, but she was grinning. "Made 45 seconds, she said. "New record." "What record? What 45 seconds?" Dunn asked. Reed opened his mouth to answer, but Pauling was too fast. "This is a graviton generator," she said, pointing to the device. "We can vary the stream from an angstrom all the way to a millimeter wide." "Angstrom?" Dunn asked. "A 10 billionth of a meter," Reed said. Dunn tried to imagine something that small and immediately failed. "Why so small?" Pauling stepped toward him. "We want to be able to change the focus and energy throughput depending on the scar's behavior. For instance, if we don't get a reaction at the smallest settings, we can raise it until we get a response." "And if you don't get a response at a millimeter?" Dunn asked. Pauling didn't look at all chagrined at the question. "We build a bigger one." "Okay," Dunn said, "but this isn't going to do damage." "Not intended to," she said. "If anything, it'll give us some idea of the energy input needed to have an effect on the scar." "Is this similar to the emissions from a gravitic engine?" Dunn asked. "Similar," Reed said, "but not the same. The gravitons pushed out by the gravitic engines would have been pointed away from the scar. Therefore, there must have been some kind of drift." Reed blinked before looking at Pauling. "Drift. Is the scar pulling in matter?" The pair stared at one another for a long moment. Pauling suddenly moved back to her display, and the rest of the scientists broke from their huddle around the device, each heading to their own workstation. He looked at Reed. "I say something wrong?" "No," Reed grinned. "I think you just answered the question we've had for days." "Drift?" Reed nodded. "Drift. I checked the orientation of the probe multiple times. I assumed there was some kind of leakage from the gravitic drives, but maybe not." "Hey, I just—" "Gave us a theory," Reed said and pointed at the device. "In any case, we have something that should work for a short duration test. Proof of concept, so to speak." "How short?" "We might get as many as 45 to 60 seconds per burst with a few minutes of rest in between," Pauling said. "How difficult are they to make?" Dunn asked. "Not very," Pauling said. "The printers are quite efficient when it comes to printing the components, and the power source is standard. They're not very complicated either." Dunn nodded as if to himself. The device sparked an idea, but it wasn't ready for him yet. Still needed time to percolate, he guessed. The more he stared at the device, though, the more he knew it was something important. "We can print a lot of these?" Dunn asked. "Yes," Reed said. "As many as we need." Dunn walked back to the gravitic engine, looking over the components, as if he might suddenly recognize something. He did, and he didn't. Damn it, what was his brain doing? "Commander?" Reed asked. Dunn turned to him. "Yes?" Reed shared a glance with Pauling. "I asked if you had an estimate for a Pluto test," Reed said. Did you? Did you really talk and I didn't hear you?" "Oh," Dunn said, cheeks flushing red. "We have 2 probes printing. Both should be ready next shift, and we have a couple of more in the queue." A childish grin lit Reed's face. "How long before the first one reaches Pluto?" "Flat out, around 23 solar hours to reach the orbit of where it used to be. The trio has a QE comms connection to the probe with a backup radio. If QE comms fails, but the radio functions, we might get a delay of 45 minutes between transmissions. It's better than nothing." "Agreed," Reed said, slightly crestfallen. "Commander?" Pauling asked. "Would it be possible to work with the trio on a probe design that includes the device?" "Of course," Dunn said. "Portunas?" "We will collaborate immediately," the SE's voice said from the overhead speakers. "Anything else you need, Dr. Reed?" Dunn asked. "Not exactly," he said, "apart from a larger test bed." Dunn frowned. "Exactly how large are we talking? And where the void do you plan on testing it?" "If," Pauling said, "we find a scar or similar damage near Pluto, and if gravitons significantly affect the area as well, then we would like to deploy something much larger to heal space." Heal space. Interesting turn of phrase. Design it, prepare it, and test a larger device as much as you can. Depending on what we find at the Pluto site, we can have something ready to go. "Thank you, Commander," Reed said. "I don't suppose it would be possible to send someone human out there." Dunn shook his head. We don't have the time nor the resources available for that right now. But it did give him an idea. As he left the grav lab and headed for another slip point, he connected to Black via block.
Yes, Commander.
How fast can you get to Pluto?
Within a day, sir. Somewhere between 20 to 23 hours, depending on my cargo.
Non-human cargo. How fast?
15 hours flat out, but I'll need time to recharge once I get there, unless I carry spare gravitic fuel. Spare fuel will considerably slow my approach.
Shit, Dunn thought. How long for a recharge?
The gravitic engines will have to cool off while the nuclear reactor recharges the cells. Depending on situational factors, the process can take anywhere between 3 and 7 hours.
Dunn didn't like that. Does this mean you'll be unable to escape in a hurry?
Relatively speaking, yes. Standard nuclear-powered thrust will allow me to move at a greatly reduced speed, but I'll be no slower than I was before the refit.
Excellent. I need you to forward a request to the quartermaster for additional blisters. We're going to load you up for a war, just in case. Black was silent for a moment, but he didn't take that as a sign for concern. The SE was innately curious and tended to ask questions about everything. He used to be impatient with that quirk for a personality, but since the Battle of the Scar and the cold realities the collective had delivered to humanity, he thought she deserved a little understanding.
What do you expect to find at the Pluto site, sir?
Something Xi showed me, something I didn't understand at the time. He thought of the memory, visualized it, and shared it with Black. A shimmering ripple in space, a shadowy thing coming through, its many arms forming a wheel around its puckered, silver-tooth-filled maw, the dark creature floating off into invisibility against the blanket of space. The fear the vision had put into Dunn's soul transferred over to Black, and he felt her revulsion.
That must be destroyed. I will carry whatever payload you need, sir.
Thank you, Black. Just be ready in case Xi wasn't pulling my leg.
Do you think that likely?
He'd reached the slip point leading to the bridge. As he entered, he said to Black, I think Xi doesn't show you something unless he knows he'll need it later. Chapter 21. The probe accelerated away from Trident Station, its gravitic engines running at nearly 90% once it traveled past Neptune's moons. The bullet-shaped automaton sped through space, leaving behind a shimmering wake of excited particles and swirls of gravitons. Hours passed while it tore through empty space and approached the place where Pluto had once been. It encountered debris fields of shattered ice and ore, but maneuvered easily through the stellar chaff. Pluto might have turned into some kind of black hole after it exploded, but it had certainly pushed junk in all directions rather than pulled it in. The probe calculated the stray ice and rock covered a spherical area whose radius was half the distance from Sol to Earth, or 0.5 AU. At less than 0.2 AU from Pluto's former position in space, the probe sent a QE message back to Trident. It had arrived. The probe continued decelerating, its gravitic drive creating a comet tail of particles. Moments later, it detected abnormal radiation readings, and its QE comms transmitter died. Shortly afterward, the probe detected its first exosolar creature. A flock or school or herd of pine cones floated in a staggered formation amidst rock and ice. As the probe sent a radio message back to Trident Station, alerting them to the exosolar creatures, a starfish hove into view, blotting out the starlight. The monstrous thing, easily the size of SNR Black, smashed into the probe. The bullet-shaped slab of metal shattered into fragments that soon joined the ice and rock. Commander, a voice said. Dunn opened his eyes and stared upward at the dim lights above his bed. The trio were slowly bringing him awake, which meant... He sat up and rubbed at his eyes. He felt as though he'd only had a few hours of sleep, and a look at the chronometer confirmed it. 4 hours. Once this business was put to bed, so to speak, he needed to take a day off, or at least allow himself a good 8 hours. 8. He'd kill for 6. Where's the probe, Portunas? Dunn asked, voice husky with sleep. The probe arrived 0.2 AU from Pluto's space. And? It reported no sign of exosolar life forms. However, we lost contact shortly afterward. The probe has either been disabled, destroyed, or QE comms are impossible in the vicinity of the event. What about radio? We did receive the preamble to a message, but the message itself was incomplete. Preamble? What the void are you talking about? The beginning of a transmission. The portion identifying the sender along with identity keys. Dunn pulled the covers off his legs, annoyed that the lights were nearly up to full. So it tried to send something. Yes, Fortuna said. But without the actual message, the preamble only tells us when the message was sent. Which was? Half an hour after we received it, which was over an hour ago. I didn't want to wake you until we were sure there was a problem. I appreciate that, he said, meaning every word of it. Fortuna's could be a so-called mother hen at times, but the SE always meant well. In Dunn's case, the SE had all but become his personal assistant. The hilarity of having one of the most, if not the most, powerful sentient computer systems in the solar systems as a comms and organizing gopher was not lost on him. It was embarrassing. He slipped out of bed and quickly donned a fresh jumpsuit. What about the scar? The Neptune Scar continues to show life, but nothing has come through. That we've detected, Dunn added. Still, I imagine we would have known by now. True. Commander, how do you intend to defend Trident Station with so few resources? He frowned at that as he hurriedly splashed water on his face, hoping the puffiness would disappear and his eyes might clear. We have more coming, he said, a little at a time. I hope we have time. Dunn ignored the prickles of goose flesh rising up his back and dried his face. We'll make time. Just be patient. I now know what humans feel like having to wait for things. Ironic. We wait on you for everything since we are able to perform our tasks so quickly. We wait on you because without you, there is nothing to do apart from think. Dunn hadn't considered that. He'd never seen things from the SE perspective, able to communicate at quantum speeds, yet severely constrained in their communications with humanity, because humans thought and acted slower than a sun-baked tortoise. He tried to imagine slowing down his thoughts enough to communicate with an invertebrate, and couldn't do it. Where are we at on building a larger platform for the GravLab generator? He asked. It will take a shift or two to get the design right and test it. It might be faster to use an alternative deployment mechanism. Such as? A ship, one large enough to deploy the platform and the generator. Lovely, he thought. Because of the possible QE interference? Yes, Commander. If the environment is similar to what it was during the Battle of the Scar, the EMR sources and levels will be catastrophic in some portions of space, while relatively tolerable in others. It will depend on how many of them there are and how long they've been there. Not exactly scientific. No, Commander. This is all conjecture at best. Some of our theories have been confirmed, while many are mere speculation. Dunn reached the bridge, a little surprised to see Copenhagen standing guard. She looked as tired as he felt. When did your shift end? It's still going, she said. Dunn shook his head. I'll tell the lieutenant you've been relieved. Sir? Get some shut-eye. That's an order. Aye, sir, Copenhagen saluted. He returned it as she trudged down the corridor. Staffing shortage. What were they going to do if there was a war? He headed into his ready room, brought up the holo display, and contacted Black. Aye, sir. 20 hours. You can get Marines to Pluto in about 20 hours. Aye, sir, she said again. As I said, if I travel without humans, I'll be able to reach the target much faster. I think you're going to need Marines, Dunn said. You've seen the latest from the GravLab? Yes, Commander, Black said. They have made extraordinary progress. They will be working with the trio on designing a platform for a larger version. Might I suggest we test the small version first, Black said. That's the problem. Our first probe crapped out. No idea why. So rather than risk another probe, you'd rather risk Marines? He knew Black wasn't being sarcastic or facetious. She just tended to sound that way. No, I'd rather not, he said. But the Scar hasn't stopped writhing like a live wire and the sensors are still freaking out over it. But it's maintaining its state, Black said. At least from what we can tell. Correct. No increases, no decreases, no change. Completely static. That's both good news and bad news, Black said. Good because it means it's not powering up to some critical phase. Bad because it also means we may have no warning before it does. Dunn sent Black an image of human stool. Black responded with the image of a shovel. He grinned, although he was sitting in his ready room with his eyes closed. Seemed like whenever he was too cynical, she put him back on track. Yes, there's shit everywhere. Let's clean it up. We need answers as quickly as we can get them. If there is some interference in QE comms, then the only way to know what's out there is to go there. Agreed, Black said. Perhaps I should go there myself? Perhaps have a chance to head off any issues before they arise? Dunn shook his head. Although I'm not sure where I'm going to get Marines from. With Dickerson and his squad aboard Von On, we don't have much left. You have officers, Black said. Captain Oakes, perhaps. A single Marine? Dunn asked. You're joking, right? No. He knows how to fly me. He is capable of fighting if he needs to, and I know he's more than acclimated to climbing on a hull if need be. Oakes was the commander of air support. Without him, Talby would be in charge. They'd have to switch Copenhagen to a gunner. Then they'd have to... Sir, Black said, might I suggest you discuss this with Lieutenant Kalimura? She will have better answers for you than you yourself. I know, Dunn said. He'd so quickly jumped into thinking like a micromanaging captain who didn't trust his subordinates, or didn't know them. Both Oakes and Kalimura had earned his trust, respect, and hopefully friendship over the past several months. He needed to do his job and let them do theirs. I'll do that, Black. Thank you. My pleasure, Commander. Just for giggles, can you find me the list of SFN pilots? I have it. There are 4 former pilots, 3 of whom never flew modern combat craft. They either moved cargo or... Don't care. Send me their names and forward them to Talby as well. We need to get some help here, and I'll take anyone that can hold a stick.